Hey, Spuddies, Potato Whiskey here, and today we're talking about Civilization 7. I've spent approximately 500 plus hours in the game, about 550 now, mostly focused on getting good at the game and learning what the game's mechanics are and how things work before I really knuckle down and produce high quality tutorial content. This has led to moments where I have misunderstood game mechanics, and it's a really exciting time in Civilization because this is when mistakes are going to be made and we will laugh about them later. But before I get into the video, I do want to take a moment to address a sentiment in the community that I've been seeing increasingly, that people feel like I have been bashing the game and raging at it since launch. I want to make sure that everyone is aware that of the last 32 videos I've released on my YouTube channel, only 2 of them have been videos where I'm critical of the game or I'm ranting about the game. If you think I've spent the last month of launch raging on different aspects of the game, the problem is that you're only ever seeing the videos that get posted to Reddit or the ones that get pushed by the algorithm because that's what people are clicking on, and not the 27 other videos of me playing and enjoying the game. Because 29 of my videos in the last month have been on Civilization 7, and 27 of them have been me just enjoying the game. And that's on top of like 20 hours of live streams. So I would kindly ask you to point out this fact that only 2 of my videos since launch were rant videos. Whenever you see someone repeating that I have been too negative or raging at the game, if you see something, say something. Now that we have that out of the way, the main problem I have with Civilization 7 is the user interface. However, because that section of this video already ballooned to like 2,000, nearly 3,000 words, I'm actually going to take that and cover it in a different video. And in this video, we're going to go over the other problems with the game. And we're going to save that UI feedback stuff for another day. So expect to see that video in the next few days. Right, okay. My first big problem with Civilization 7 is that production is king. Now, production has always been king in Civilization games. Production and science, that's how you rush through the tech tree. But I think with the way the age systems work now, production has become even more king. There is just no resource in the game that can compete with getting more production. It's fundamentally the most powerful resource, above even gold, for example, because it's the resource that gives you the most agency in the entire game. To put it another way, if I double my production, I double the number of things that I can build. If I double my science, I double the rate at which I unlock things to build. It does not make much sense to specialize my empire towards science until I can keep up with the continuous flow of new infrastructure to produce. Production is, simply put, too powerful on the way the game plays. Most importantly though, is hitting certain production breakpoints, whereby you can produce infrastructure or units in 1 or 2 turns, is extremely overwhelming on the game's systems. Almost every stat check in the game boils down to how much production you have. Sometimes the game also rewards you for having gold. One of the great things about Civ 6 is that you had an extra production currency called Faith that was used to produce things you couldn't normally do. I think moving away from having more resources that give players agency was a net negative for the game. Production is so incredibly more powerful than food that it feels bad to try and grow with a lot of food. Like, growing really big, powerful, huge population cities just kind of feels bad in Civilization 7. I just don't feel like I'm getting rewarded for it. And I'm not really sure how to solve that problem. But another thing that held back production in Civilization 6 was the constant need, on top of faith, right, was the constant need to produce builders to sustain the growth of your population with tile improvements. You were also limited in the number of districts you could actually build in a city based on its population, so food was a limiting factor on production. And now I'm not saying that these things should make a comeback exactly as they were. More so, I want to point them out and make a comparison to a recent Civ game, so that we can know that, okay, important production sinks and limitations that were present in previous games aren't present in Civilization 7, and we should be aware about how that's affecting the way the game feels, because production just feels more powerful than it's ever been. On top of being easier to get, which I don't think is a particularly good combination. I think if something is powerful, it should be hard to get. At least up to a point, right? Now the thing about this that I really want to focus on for the players and the developers is that growing huge cities with massive amounts of food, which is, for a lot of people, one of the most fun ways to play the game, right? You grow a big city, you get a lot of population, you work a lot of tiles. In Civilization 7, it feels kind of bad, right? Because the player feels like they're being punished for not just getting the better resource, which is production, right? At least I feel that way. I don't know if other people feel the same. That is the vibe I've been getting from playing a lot. Growth just feels underwhelming and not particularly good compared to just getting more production. Production feels like the resource that gives you the most agency in the game, to the point where my philosophy in game now is to pretty much ignore anything except for the production number on a tile when I'm choosing a rural tile improvement. There are situations where you want to play, you want to grow to a resource or grow to a tile that you're going to put a building on. But generally speaking, I've just been focusing super hard on getting that production number bigger, because that is what has been giving me the most success in Civilization 7. I have no idea what the right fix is for this in Civilization 7. I do have a couple of suggestions that I can throw out there for consideration, and I hope to stimulate good conversation on this topic in the comments of this video, as well as on Discord, on Reddit, and the Civ Fanatics forums. Like, I hope people are going to start talking about this a little bit more, and maybe come up with ideas. Because here's the thing, I could be wrong. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe production is fine. Maybe people think the production is fine. I am not the arbiter of truth in Civilization. But here's my first idea. I think making it so that there are ways to convert food or other resources into something other than population would be useful for dethroning production. So, for example, what if settlers were produced with food, or food and production, right? What if infantry units, like what if there was a unit that you could use for defense that was produced using food, right? Like a militia unit. Actually, Old World kind of does this sort of thing, right? You've got civilian units that are produced with growth or food, and then you've got military units which are produced with like this sort of red production resource, and then you've got a sort of city infrastructure that's produced with another resource, right? And what if you differentiated what a production queue was, right? What if you built something, like let's say you're building a settler using the food of the city, okay? Then the production gets converted into gold automatically. Or if you're building a missionary, right? Maybe that uses culture as its construction resource. Or you could have, happiness be a construction resource. Having different resources produce different units would make production less dominant, I think. I'm not saying it's a perfect solution. I'm just throwing it out there, right? Just throwing it out there, roll it around in your noggin, have a think about it. The reason why I think this would be good is if we go back to the food example, is it would give growth-heavy empires who are growing a lot of population the ability to expand their empire using their strong growth and build military with their strong growth, right? Now, it would be a fairly weak unit, right? Infantry or a militia of some kind, but it means if you want to go tall, right, if you want to build a lot of buildings, you focus on production. If you want to go wide, you focus on growth, because you want to build a lot of settlers and you want to build a lot of settlements and stuff like that. And if you want to do a little bit of both, you do a little bit of both. I think it could be interesting, like what if you use the city's gold per turn to produce traders, or even food or to produce traders. I think food works a little bit better. But I think this having useful alternatives to just production would help dethrone it, I think. You can do similar things using happiness, happiness for missionaries, etc., or explorers, or whatever, culture and happiness, but the point is, right, as it currently stands, the game mostly rewards you for getting your happiness number above 0, and then it doesn't benefit you anymore. You just want to have enough growth in a city to get it up and running, and then you want to start feeding it with towns, and you could just never have enough production. There's a certain point where like there's almost no diminishing return point on production until you're producing things 1 per turn, and then there's no then you don't want any more production. Whereas there's a lot more diminishing return points for things like culture and science and stuff like that. And it's not like this isn't without precedent, right? Like in previous Civilization games, growth was used for building settlers and builders. I think in Civ 4. And there was pop chopping, where you could lose population to rush the construction of something. And I think Civilization just suffers from the lack of diversity in what resources you can use for what resources give you agency over your game. And I think it hurts the game a little bit. I don't necessarily think that it's inherently bad that production is king, and you can design around that and it's perfectly fine. It's just that if it is a problem that you think needs to be solved, I've thrown out a couple of ideas and I've described why it might be a problem. And I think it's mainly just comes down to that non-production oriented strategies just don't feel very good. They're just not very good. Maybe gold feels kind of okay. If you have the right cultures and civs and leaders, gold feels fine. Anyway, yeah, so to summarize that problem, it's that production. I know I repeated myself a little bit and people hate that. Remember, this is like 50% script, 50%, off the cuff. I have basically notes that I use to guide my thoughts here in these kind of videos. To summarize, I think production is king, and that might be something that the game wants to look at. Again, like, I could work around it, but maybe it's worth it to consider other options. My second problem with the game is that crises are too superficial and predictable. And so is the end of an age. I have a love-hate relationship with the crisis system. When it's working well, I'm really enjoying it. However, when I was a new player to the game, like first 20 to 50 hours, I want to say, probably round about that, the time has become an ephemeral mistress to which I only bow down to as I slowly grow new grey hairs. I really hated the crisis system when I first started playing Civ because it felt random, it felt unfun, I didn't understand what was happening. And now that I have a couple of hundred hours in the game, or a few hundred hours in the game, I quite like the crisis system because it sets up this kind of like mildly unpredictable challenge for me to overcome. Should I keep expanding in the ancient era in case I get that one that your cities start rebelling if you have too many cities? These are things that I have to think about. And I quite like that. I like that I'm considering risk probabilities. That's a satisfying decision sort of tree. But I really think it just comes down to the crisis system feels anemic in terms of, first of all, its impact on gameplay and how little agency I feel like I have as a player over the outcomes and process of the crisis. The crisis system right now feels like it has massive potential, but I think in its current implementation, it feels a little bit tacked on to the end of an age, right? Like, the best way to deal with a crisis is to save up your milestone progress and then try to shoot right past the crisis, which feels kind of out of the spirit of them. A crisis feels like it's something that you should have to deal with. And I think that's something that I would like to see the developers just like try to make some tweaks, maybe a rework of something here or there. I'm not saying they have to scrap the whole system from the ground up. The bones of what they have is really interesting. I want to see some meat in those bones, you know what I mean? Maybe throw, a scapular muscle or something. Now, in my mind, I feel like the crisis system would work best as a risk or reward style system with real consequences and effects. So, for example, let's say, currently, as it stands in the game, rather, when a plague event happens, your cities will randomly get the plague and some negative effects will happen to the city. Maybe some buildings get damaged, you lose a population, a migrant spawns, whatever. And what I'm thinking here is, what if I, as a player, I could choose to infect cities with the plague in return for some kind of bonus later, right? Basically playing like a sort of narrative challenge mode whenever a crisis pops up. What if I choose to be, like your advisor recommends quarantining the city and I'm like, nonsense, we must have our festival of lights or whatever, and then boom, the city is just riddled with plague. You know what I mean? Like, I want we all know the correct option when there's a plague happening is you shut the city down and you try to beat the plague by isolating. But I want to have the option to throw parties at Downing Street. You know what I mean? Like, I want to have the option to be a bad leader, and then I want the game to both punish and reward me for doing that. I think that would be kind of more interesting, right? Let's say whenever a crisis happens, there's 3 crisis events, and let's say there's 3, whenever one happens, you get 3 options. You get a sort of low risk option where you might take some kind of penalty, right? Like, let's say towns will no longer send food to connected cities for the duration of the plague due to quarantines, but your cities will not get infected as often, right? You take some penalty, but you get a benefit. But then what if you had like a high risk option where you get some crisis points and a whole bunch of your cities get infected, and then those crisis points could be used during the age transition to reshape your empire, right? Like, you could rename cities, you could boost technologies, you could take some kind of bonuses, like crisis-specific legacy bonuses, which are already kind of in the game. But what if there was like the core conceptual of the idea I'm having here is like, what if I was doing so well in the game that I'm like, I want my empire to get hit with this massive crisis so that I can get some kind of bonus. And also, it's just kind of fun, right? I don't know how many of you guys did this, but when I was a kid, whenever I built a city in SimCity 2000 or whichever one it was the 2D one, I would get to a point where I was kind of tired of the city, and then I would open up the menu for disasters and then just start hitting it with like tornadoes and volcanoes and stuff, because I wanted to see that stuff just get burnt, because I was done with my map. And I feel like this idea has like a little bit of potential, right? And most of the bones for this kind of thing kind of already exists in the game as it stands. And I don't necessarily need the developers to implement my idea, exactly word for word. But I would like to see the Crisis shine as a feature in Civilization 7. It's a new feature, and I currently don't think the Crisis system is really shining. It's not shining bright like a diamond, you know what I mean? And I would really like the developers to add... I mean, this is a me thing, right? I'd like to see more unpredictability to the Crisis system and the end of an age. If at the very least they implemented some kind of an option for the final turn of an age to be somewhat random, I think I would be willing to experiment with that and try it out. What if when the age progress hit 100%, instead the game rolled a 4-sided dice, and that's how many turns were going to be left after that. So you're getting 1 to 4 extra turns, and that's it, to finish up your last little bits. I also think it'd be kind of interesting if like Crisis cards could be played against other players, like to penalize them in the age transition, or if you could play Crisis cards against your own empire in the age transition. Like what if I just completely wiped out a settlement? It completely gets depopulated in exchange for a Crisis point that I can spend on something else. I think it would be really interesting if there was just kind of more going on in the age transition and the Crisis stuff. I think it's a really cool feature with a lot of potential, and I would like to see it made more interesting. But my third problem with Civilization 7 is that warehouse buildings are a little bit of a problem for the gameplay. I think conceptually they work kind of interestingly and they're kind of neat, but I think the more you play the game, you start to notice the issues with them. And the first way that I think warehouse buildings are a problem is that the earlier, and like as in earlier in the ages, like so ancient era or antiquity or whatever, the earlier and cheaper warehouse buildings are simply much better than the later warehouse buildings. This is partially because they exist earlier into the game, and so you're benefiting from them for a longer period of time. But it's also partially because the total effect that you get from building more warehouse buildings becomes diminishing. When your tiles are already producing 5 production per turn in the modern age, adding an ironworks for over 1,000 gold doesn't really make that big of a difference. This is especially in towns, right? And that gold could easily be spent elsewhere and probably is better off being spent there, all right? An average ironworks, right, is unlikely to provide a good return on investment, at least when its production is being converted into gold in a town. An average modern age, for me, where I'm not rushing to victory, it might last around 100 turns, right? If I'm rushing to victory, it could be anywhere from like 20 to 50 turns, depending on how insane my luck is or what my build looks like. Maybe closer to 60 in certain instances. I don't know. I'd have to actually check the data, but that's sort of like the vibe, right? So if I have let's just say I have a 15 production ironwork, right? It would barely pay for itself by the end of the game if I built it on turn 1, because it costs about 1,500 gold, right? About 1,500 gold, and it's producing 15 gold per turn, and the age will last about 100 turns, so it's just about paying itself off by the end of the age. So an average ironworks for me when I'm playing Civilization 7, it barely produces like a third to half of its value in gold by the end of an age. And you contrast that to something like a brickyard, which will easily pay for itself by the end of an ancient age, and then it will continue to pay out dividends over and over and over again. And I think that this illustrates the problem. I don't know how to address the problem, but I do think it is a problem that needs to be addressed. And the sort of second part of warehouse buildings is that they clog up your city tiles and they don't really provide benefits to specialists. So they kind of get in the way in 2 different ways, right? Since the optimal tile for where you might want to put a building can shift between the ages as your resources like appear or disappear, or your wonders or whatever, right? And there's no way to get rid of warehouse buildings. It's very easy to end up with a warehouse building squatting on a tile that you would otherwise use for its science adjacency. And it's kind of the same problem that you had for Civilization 6, where you weren't able to delete or remove districts without a mod. It's a little bit frustrating, to say the least, but it's not the end of the world. I also really don't like placing specialists in warehouse buildings, as it feels terrible. It just feels like a wasted potential. And I think there's a lot of different ways you could address this issue, but most of my ideas sort of involve tweaking the numbers and moving things around. And I think this part of gameplay might actually just need a rework, right? I think warehouse buildings are probably in need of a rework. I think if warehouse buildings work the way that they do right now, a year or two from now, right, with all the patches and plans and stuff like that, I would be pretty disappointed in the game's development direction. Because I think warehouse buildings, at least for the city development stuff right now, they stand out to me as the biggest outlier that is problematic on the feel of playing the game. Now, the fourth issue that I have with the game is that, and this is a classic issue with the AI does not make cities that feel good to capture, both in terms of where they settle their cities, how they settle their cities, and how they build their cities. They just make cities that don't feel good to capture. And what I mean by this is, I'm not saying the AI isn't good at the game, right? This is a distinctly different problem with the game than the AI not being good. I actually don't really care about the AI being good at the game. I care about the AI being an interesting challenge to overcome. Right now, I think the AI is reasonably interesting to overcome, although in time, I suspect I'll become bored with beating the AI as I'm starting to figure out their weaknesses and the optimal strategies required to, outpace them. The AI isn't the worst Civilization or even 4X AI that I've ever seen, but they definitely aren't the best either. I think a lot could be achieved by making sure the AI always builds their unique quarter in cities. One of the frustrating aspects of Civilization 6 was that if an AI had a bunch of unique infrastructure and you captured their city, the unique infrastructure would disappear. Instead, in Civilization 7, capturing the AI cities is sometimes frustrating because occasionally they've sprinkled their special, unique cultural ageless buildings that you can't remove around on random tiles instead of putting them on the same tile and building their unique districts. I haven't actually seen this happen all that much, so I wouldn't say this is necessarily a massive problem with the game, but I also needed 7 problems to make the 7 problems with Civilization 7 after 700 hours, or 500 hours or whatever. It just looked nice, but this is a problem that I've come into, right? Whenever I capture an AI city where they haven't built the buildings on the same tile, I get the impression that the AI is bad at the game. And so I don't necessarily think that making the AI do this will make them actually better at the game, but I think making them always build their unique infrastructure district will make it look like the AI is better at the game and make me feel like the AI is better at the game, which is a very self-aware thing to hear from a player, probably, if you're a game developer. I want to point out that time that people talked about how a gun wasn't very good and all the developer did was make the noise better and louder, and then they were like, oh yeah, this gun's really good now. So the fifth problem that I have with Civilization 7 is that I feel artificially restricted and constrained as a player when I'm playing the game. I feel like I'm making decisions within a well-defined box rather than making a sort of vibes-based decision based on how the game feels to play. And I think constraining the player isn't necessarily a bad thing, right? Constraints breed creativity. You have to come up with a creative solution to a problem. But I think a classic example of this, the perfect example of this, is the settlement limit, right? You could do some rebranding and tweaks to the settlement limit, right? It just feels a little bit arbitrary. And I think that's the really important thing, is that the settlement limit feels sort of arbitrary and artificial. Like, what if it was called bureaucratic capacity or government capacity or corruption or something, right? Limits on the player's abilities don't feel as bad to interact with if the limits feel justified. Settlement capacity just feels too arbitrary. And I think it's a small example of a small example that's actually emblematic of the game's limitations that it places upon you just feeling unjustified and too gamey, right? And not vibes enough. And there's a lot of things like this in the game that feel a little bit weird or unearned, where the game just feels like it's restricting you for the sake of restricting you without ever justifying it. Like, why can't I tear down a granary 3,000 years into the future? Like, if I build a granary on turn 10 of the ancient age, of the antiquity age, why can't I delete that granary 300 turns later in the modern age? I don't understand. You know, why do I have a settlement limit? What is the settlement limit? What am I being limited by? Now, I know, like, it's very easy for me to come up with my own, like, oh, I don't have enough bureaucrats. We don't, you know, the fastest guy in the world is a man on a horse. Like, that's what we're being limited by. But I want the game to give me better justification of these limits than it being incumbent on me to come up with those in my headcanon. And I do think part of the restrictions also come from the one-dimensional nature of legacy paths. While they don't necessarily restrict a player's actions because of the fact that they give you rewards, right? The rewards of following a legacy path can make it feel like you're being pigeonholed down a narrow scope of viable paths to achieve your goals or victories, right? And I don't think that feels particularly great. And so I think that this is just an area of the game where I think it needs like a little bit of, you know, spit shine and a little bit of attention. The sixth problem I have with Civilization 7 is that I feel like the game lacks options and variety. If you go back to previous Civilization games, there is a rich amount of customization options for setting up a game. While definitely some of the possible configurations you can choose in previous Civ games could lead to you having a bad game, I don't think that's a good enough reason to not give the player some more options and control over their games. For example, it would be fun to spawn a lot more natural wonders on the map in the game setup, or having raging independent people. I'm sure there's a lot of room for customization options like world age, wetness, resource abundance, and I hope that they focus on adding meaningful ways to adjust the gameplay experience. But I do think the lack of this stuff makes the game feel like a bit of a step back, right? Because if I go back to play Civilization 4, you'll lose your goddamn mind at the number of options you have on the game setup screen. And while I am definitely okay with the developers trimming that list and cutting back on the number of game setup options you have, I would still like to have more than we currently have. I think that's the core and key part of this feedback here, is I would like to see more options for customizing the game. And now the final issue I have with the game is actually about the Civilization community. And it has to do with the temperature in the room since Civilization 7 was announced, since all the features were announced, and since launch. The number of people commenting on my channel that the game sucks and that I should go back to playing Civ 6 or Civ 5 is staggering. In addition, the number of people calling me a shill for the game, a liar, or saying that I'm raging and hating on the game, or I'm posting rage bait content instead of playing it, is absolutely baffling, considering 27 out of the 32 videos on my channel have just been me like playing the game or doing tutorials or whatever. And there's other things, right? Like the people on Reddit and the forums and all this sort of stuff there's been a lot of hostility in the game right around de nouveau and all these things. And what I really want to focus on is drilling down and encouraging everyone to try and be better in how we speak to each other and the developers and how we express our opinions. I've done a little bit of self-reflection, and I think a combination of maybe not communicating perfectly on my end and using too much performative emotion for the entertainment value of my content has led to the temperature in the room being a little bit too high. And so I'm going to be taking a more old school, cold school approach to these kind of analysis videos. A lot of people really appreciated the way that I was doing things, and I quite enjoy that sort of performative anger or performative joy or whatever it is, right? Where you take a feeling that you have and you amplify it to be expressive and passionate and fiery, right? But I think we're gonna go back to having a few more of these calmer, more relaxed videos where we just talk about the game, we talk about the game's issues, we create space for people to give their opinions, give their feedbacks, and I would really appreciate it if you could all join me in that, right? Let's bring the temperature in the room down a little bit. If you see people saying insane things about the game, about me, other creators, whatever, calmly tell them that the things that they are saying are wrong or insane or incorrect or whatever. Just say, hey, I don't think that's true. Hey, that's not real. Or hey, blah, blah, blah. And similarly, if you see people waving away valid criticism of the game, I want you to call them out on it. If you see someone saying like, oh, that's not a big deal because X, you say like, no, it is a big deal because that other person cares about it, right? This is their game and they're disappointed in it because of this reason, right? This matters to that person, and just because it doesn't matter to you doesn't mean you get to dismiss it. So let's try to make the community of Civilization the best, earn that title of being the best fans in gaming, and instead of being at each other's throats all the time. Anyway, yeah, that's it for me. 7 problems I have with Civilization 7. I love you all very much, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye!